Today, we're talking about the Sony a7R and the Sony a7 IV. This system ships and is compatible with either camera, depending on what you're shooting. It's calibrated for the Sony a7R, but it also ships with a camera mount, letting you shoot the a7 IV. Now today, I'm going to be shooting the a7R, so we'll focus on that. Let's just dive right into this housing and what it looks like. Now, you'll notice that I have a few accessories added to this housing that are conducive to my needs and my shooting style. Initially starting out with the dual tray and handle, you'll notice that I have the right handle on here. And the reason I do that is I need the stability, and I also need two mounting points for my dual strobe setup. And because I have that second handle on here, I've added an extension to both the shutter and the back button because I do back button focus. So if you look on the left-hand side of the housing, I've added the USB-C bulkhead here, and that is going to let me both charge my camera as well as offload my images without disassembling anything. So let's just dive right in on it and get into assembly. So let's start by opening up the housing, and to do that, I'm going to put it face down on my assembly mat like so, and you'll notice that there are 3 lid snap levers that hold the back on, and I'm going to open each one of those individually. And to do that, I have to lift up on the locking lever, and then I can lift up on the lid snap itself, and I will do that for all 3 of the lid snaps. And then they simply lift up and over the hooks on the back, and now I can simply lift the back off of the front, flip it over, and set it aside. Inside, as I previously mentioned, you'll notice that I have the USB-C bulkhead, which goes to the USB-C lead, which will plug into the USB-C port of my camera. And then I also have the hot shoe. Here I have the manual hot shoe, which is ground and trigger only, but I will swap this out for a TTL option as I build my strobe setup later. But to start with, what I'm going to do is make sure that these are set aside. I'm going to take the opportunity to lift this lever, which is the back button focus, up and out of the way, and then I'm going to make sure that all of my hub tires are pushed up and that there's going to be nothing interfering with the camera as it ends up sliding into the front. And that takes me to the camera mount, which slides out of the base. Now you'll notice that it has a simple 1/4-20 screw that corresponds to the 1/4-20 port on the camera itself. So let's go ahead and look at that. I've got the camera, and you'll notice the 1/4-20 mount, 1/4-20 screw. If you look at this camera mount, you'll notice that there's an anti-rotational wall here, and that is going to actually butt up against the camera body. As you flip the LCD screen out, it's going to butt up against this face here. So line up the screw, and you'll notice that that wall faces the camera at that point. And then use a flat-headed screwdriver to tighten that down onto your camera. Now here is where you want to make sure that this is snug. No need to go crazy and over-tighten it, but you do want to make sure it's nice and snug on your camera. Any movement between the camera mount and the camera itself will translate to a misalignment in controls. So now that we have our camera mount installed, you'll notice that this still allows for a tripod, so you can add your camera with the camera mount to a tripod, and it allows your screen to move freely as well, so you don't have to initially remove this. I leave it attached during the entire trip. Now that I have that attached, I'm going to open up the port on the side of the camera so that the USB-C is exposed, which is the top there, not the bottom. And that's going to correspond to my USB-C plug here. And I'm going to slide the hot shoe all the way forward on the camera. And that's going to be applicable whether I'm using the standard manual hot shoe that comes with the camera housing, or if I swap it out and shoot the TTL hot shoe. Now I'm going to light up the camera mount with the camera base, and I'm going to slide the camera into place until it's all the way forward. Take my back button control, rotate it down, check my hub controls to make sure that they correspond to the camera. And now before I close up the back, I'll take the opportunity to look at this ceiling surface and make sure I have no debris and that it's clean. And then I can slide that to the side, and I'm going to turn my attention to the back itself. And here I'm going to look at the O-ring. You'll notice that the O-ring is always following an outside perimeter and never taking an inside turn. that keeps it always in the same place. It always wants to go there, so I don't have to worry about it tucked into a groove. And all I have to do, because this is a compression seal, is make sure that it's clean. I don't need to apply lubricant to this O-ring, and that's actually a benefit because lubricant has a tendency to attract debris. So that looks clean. Sealing surface is clean. Simply line up the back with the front, set it in place, and then we're going to tighten each of the lid snaps. So make sure to take all three and make sure they're up and over onto the hooks of the back. And then simultaneously, I lock the left and the right. And then I make sure they're pushed all the way forward. And then I give it a double check to make sure that the lock engaged and that they can't come up on their own. And then I'll come up and do the top one. Same thing. I also like to take an opportunity here to look at the O-ring itself and make sure that it gets compressed and that it looks like everything is fine. In this case, we are good to go. This is one of the best features of our housings, is the clear back. Not only do I get to see that O-ring seal and its integrity, I also get to see my camera and its integrity all throughout during the dive and before. Okay, now that I have the camera body installed, I'm going to add the lens, and today I'm going to be shooting the 12-24 G Master lens. So that's going to use this gear sleeve. So going to set the housing down like so. I will remove the retaining ring that came with the housing, shipped like that, and the protective cap by flipping over the housing, setting that aside, exposing my camera. And now I can take the body cap off the camera, drop in my gear sleeve, take my retaining tool, drop it in place. Using my tool, I can tighten this down. Again, this just keeps it in place, so I don't need to go crazy and over tighten this. Do check to make sure that my gear sleeve turns when I rotate the zoom knob on the housing. And I will take note of the white dot on the lens, the white dot on the camera body, align those two, lock it in place. After it's bayoneted on, I double check to make sure that my drive is zooming the lens, and we are good to go there. Now in this case, I have the need for a 28mm extension, and I'm going to be using the large dome port. So we're going to go ahead and put those together. And to do so, I'm going to take a little bit of the lubricant between my finger and thumb. I'm going to run it around the port sealing O-ring on the housing. I'm going to visually inspect it, and I'm also going to apply some of that lubricant. Again, you can feel something on an O-ring oftentimes before you ever see it. Check your extension. Put some lubricant on the sealing surface there. It's that vertical wall just past the thumb screws. Make sure that each of the thumb screws is backed out and not protruding to the inside diameter of the extension. I'm going to take that. You'll notice that there are 3 thumb screws on here that correspond to the pockets on the base of the housing. Align those thumb screws with those pockets. Like so, pressing down equally around the circumference until it pushes flush with the face, and then you can tighten up the 3 thumb screws. This is just a finger tight application. You don't need to use a tool. The seal occurred when those 2 pieces went together. Now we're going to repeat that process for the O-ring on the extension, and then finally the dome port. On the dome port, again, make sure that the 3 thumb screws are backed out. Apply a little bit of lubricant to the inside diameter. Now take a look at the back of the dome port. You'll notice that one of the 3 thumb screws corresponds to the shade. That is going to be the top or the noon position on our housing. They're all backed out. And again, the extension has the same pockets that the port base did. We're going to line up the thumb screws with those pockets. And then evenly press down until those 2 pieces go together, and then tighten up the thumb screws. Same thing, thumb screws are just there to retain the 2 pieces. The seal occurred when the 2 pieces went together. Now, if you ever have to take this assembly off, you can do it just the way we put it together, one piece at a time, or you can take off the dome and extension together as one assembly. And that is that as far as assembly goes. And there's one more step that I like to take, and that is creating a vacuum for this system. To do so, all we need is the vacuum pump, because the housing comes with the valve pre-installed. And all we have to do here is push the button on the side of the valve, and that will release the cap, which is tethered, and it will allow us to put the barb of the vacuum into the valve. And you'll hear it click into place. Now all we have to do is pump the hand pump. So I've pumped it to 10 on the gauge. Now the number that you choose is not critical. What is critical is that the needle is not moving, because if the needle's moving, that means air's transferring, and if air's transferring, that means water will transfer. So now that I've pumped it to 10, I'm going to go ahead and remove the vacuum pump itself, again by pushing the button on the valve, removing the barb, and then making sure that I re-plug the valve. And I do that as a habit. I always take the barb out and put the cap in, take the cap out, put the barb in. It's just it's a good habit to get into. You're gonna be making sure that you don't leave the cap out, which would be bad if you went to depth. It would eventually let water in. So what I do is, ideally, I would have done this the night before, set my system up, created a vacuum, shot some pictures, make sure I had a card. The next day I would have reinserted the vacuum gauge, checked to make sure that I still had a pressure differential, meaning that it would have held overnight. That's in a perfect scenario, and if you don't have that opportunity, go ahead and give yourself at least 15-20 minutes. It's important not to leave the vacuum valve attached, because if this valve itself is compromised, it could give you a false reading that you have a leak in the housing when you don't, when it's really something wrong with the pump. That's why I take that out. It is important to note that you will go diving with this under a vacuum. When you create a vacuum on the housing, it reinforces all the closing mechanisms, in addition to ensuring that you didn't miss an O-ring. And it is also important to note that you will not be able to disassemble your system when it's under a vacuum, because all of the ports are going to be pulled together. One last note on this vacuum, especially with this USB-C system: if I take the cap off to offload an image or charge my camera, I will lose vacuum past that board, that circuit board inside the USB-C bulkhead, which means I will have to redo the vacuum every time I charge or take the images off my camera. Now, that's still way more convenient than having to disassemble the system, so it's still a huge benefit. Lastly, in order to release the vacuum, you can release the vacuum one of two ways: by pushing the button on the bottom of the valve, or if you don't have this and you need to access it, you can simply insert a pencil, and you'll notice that inside the valve itself, once you take the cap off, that there's a little white button that you can push, and that will release the vacuum. Other than that, you're good to go diving. If you have any questions whatsoever about this system, or adding strobes or lighting, or really anything underwater photography, drop us a comment down below, or feel free to shoot us an email to ikelite@ikelite.com.